The night of February 5th, 1976, George and Kathleen Lutz and their 3 children fled their home in Amityville, New York, and never returned. For them, the horror was over. Their living nightmare shocked audiences around the world in the Amityville Horror. But before them, another family lived in this house and were caught by the original evil.
Sooner or later, we should probably start talking about Amityville.
We should head that direction.
Yeah. Well, it's been a minute. We were all excited when we started this podcast, getting all ready to go. Oh, so many things that we could tackle.
We're going to do this, and
we're going to do that. We're going to do that. Well, once a week. Let's be conservative and say just once a week. We could do it every day, every few hours, but no, we'll do once a week. But no, it's been a minute because apparently life is about more than just talking about films. So,
Allegedly,
yeah. Well, certainly, yeah. I came down with the COVID, so
that's right.
That meant not so much that I couldn't do a podcast. I could do a podcast through my COVID. I wouldn't mind, but yeah, it also meant having the kids at home because they all had it. So yeah, no, not really a good environment for doing potty.
No, it's not. I was asleep for most of it.
Yep. Aaron fell asleep. Basically, we've been restricted by our stupid mortal bodies, our physical material self.
Yes,
getting in the way of our cerebral.
It's getting close to the point where I'm starting to get I'm losing my patience.
Losing your patience with your body.
I'm going to be getting a bit Burt Young on it soon, I think.
Oh, look at that segue.
Yeah, good.
Well, how are we going to do this then? We've decided this time to talk about the Amityvilles because not because, and you can speak for yourself, but certainly from my end, I'm not an especially big fan of these films. In fact, I think the first and the third one are quite bad. I think the second one, which Aaron actually turned me on to, I'd never seen it. I didn't think there was much need to. It isn't something that I'd heard much good things, said. It's not especially fondly remembered, I don't think. It might be getting a bit of a reappraisal, but it's not like people said, okay, well, if you didn't like the first Amityville, try the second one. It was more... But then Aaron told me, implored me to go and watch Amityville II at some point, years and years ago, and I did, kind of, slightly rolling my eyes, going, oh, God, all right, let's see what this is like. And actually, but not sure enough, it actually is significantly, to me anyway, significantly better than the first one. It's just a bit more interesting, I think, better made. It's got some fun ideas and camera work, especially, like Aaron mentioned. His camera work is quite ambitious and pretty good for a film like that. Yeah. So
in watching it this time, is this the first you've seen it since then?
Yes, yeah. So I watched it once when he recommended it to me, and then I think I showed bits and pieces of it to other people. But yeah, that's been years, and I hadn't seen it since then. I hadn't seen the first Amityville since I was a teenager, because I remember watching it and just not thinking much of it at all. I kind of assumed that it's one of those films that's unlike the Exorcist or Texas Chainsaw Massacre or other kind of iconic 70s horror films. Mm-hmm. It just didn't seem like one which ever had the same... It had the impact of being based on a true story, which I think everyone kind of assumed must be sort of true, without looking much further into it. I guess the book came first, right? The Amityville horror book about the supposedly true case. So I guess, and then the movie came almost instantly after that, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it was like a sensation, but as a film, I don't remember hearing about it in particularly fond terms, and certainly having seen it myself, I didn't think very fondly of it. So I'd kind of ignored it up until you recommended the second one, and then I watched that and thought, yes, that's a lot better. But going back to the first one and watching that and still finding it quite boring and just not particularly interesting, I did worry, maybe watching the second one, I'm actually not going to think that was as good as I remembered seeing it. But no, the second one to me still held up pretty well. If anything, maybe a little bit better than the first time I saw it. Third one, less said about the better, I think.
I've only seen the third one once, I think.
Yeah, Amityville 3D. I'd actually, I wasn't sure if... I wasn't sure that it was Amityville 3D, but yeah, it is. Directed by, and I only just learned this, having watched it recently, directed by Richard Fleischer, who has made a couple of my favorite childhood films. He made The Vikings and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, with both of those with Kirk Douglas. He made Barabbas, which you must be familiar with.
Yeah.
Which I don't think I've seen since I was very young, but I do remember it. Is that a good Jesus film, Barabbas? I mean, it's not really a Jesus film.
I haven't seen it in a long time either. It's like maybe a teenager or in my it's been 15 plus years since I saw it.
Right.
But I have a list of sort of, because for another thing that I do periodically, what Sean is referring to is the thing to do with Jesus films, and so for things to do in the future, I've got these kind of groups of films that I've got kind of cordoned off, and I'll look at all those at the same time, and I do have that on there, but I've yet to go back to it. So I honestly I don't know how it holds up or how it was in the first place. Really, I can't even think.
From what I remember of it, it's only a Jesus film, kind of similar to the Robe. Where the actual film takes place after Jesus has died. Usually, Jesus dies at the beginning of these films, and then you're seeing the knock-on effects.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I can't remember if Jesus is even in it. I assume he's in it at the very beginning, but other than that, I remember it's Barabbas kind of being carted off from place to place. I think he ends up as a gladiator at one point.
Yes, he has. Yeah. There's quite a saga.
But anyway, then Richard Fleischer does Amityville 3D, which is really odd, and it's quite shit as well.
Yes.
But those are my opinions on the films in general. I think the first one I don't think is very good still. The second one I think is, I mean, as a story, as a whatever, it's kind of, but it's well made. I think. Mm-hmm. I think there are some interesting ideas in there, and then the third one, can't be asked with that really. But what do you think? Like, I don't know what you think about the first one.
The first one, the franchise in general, it's strange because it's one of the most famous franchises. I mean, it's people are probably as familiar with it as they are with A Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th or any of these, or Scream, or these long-running things. But the difference is that I would imagine, I mean, people could probably tell you, you can imagine that there are people who know what each installment of A Nightmare on Elm Street is like. And I cannot believe that there's anyone, really, who would call themselves a fan of the Amityville series,
right,
so that they could tell you the difference between the one that came out in 1992 and the one that came out a bit later in 1992 and the one that came out in 1993 and the one that went on to TV the month before. It's like, it's
and arguably, it's sort of tied with the newer, like the Conjuring films, the extended Warren verse. which technically aren't Amityville, but like the Amityville case turns up at the beginning of Conjuring 2, I think.
It is, yeah.
Very, very briefly. So, it's all tied in. We'll get to that later because the Warrens are involved somehow or other. But, yeah, and then there was the Amityville Horror remake with Ryan Reynolds in, I don't know, 2005 or so.
Melissa George.
That's right, yeah, Melissa George. Who is...
Well, that's the thing. I was looking back because I remembered at that time, the time the remake came out, I was a feisty young blogger in the world, and so I knew I had written something about that, and so because just to answer your, it's a series where certain bits stand out for me, but the films themselves, I mean, some of them have their moments, and the second one is the only one where I would say, Jesus, that's like, the second one is so much better than any of the others I've seen that it feels supernatural in itself as a thing to exist, relative to how mundane and boring so much of the rest of them are. And the first one is, I feel much, because I look back and it turns out what I thought at that time was, well, if everyone was very keen to pull stuff from the 70s at that time or the early 80s, and my thinking was, well, if you're going to remake anything from that time, it makes sense to aim at something like this where people have an idea of what it is, but the film itself wasn't very good in the first place. Right. But I did say, but you leave the second one alone because that's a different like, I've since learned that a recent installment, if you could call it that, is pretty much a remake of the second one. But yeah, so I never rated any of them all that highly. Some of them were flat out awful. Some of them were really boring. So, and I don't know when it is that the second one announced itself as something different, because now I would say that that's one of my favorite films of all time.
Oh, really?
I don't know when I started feeling like that. I know I did see it as a when I was growing up, like really wee. And I know that then by the time of that remake, I had decided it was, as I still believe it to be. But I don't know why that is. I don't know when that happened. I do remember a time when I was old enough to watch it and to be realizing just how much was going on in some of those, like that possession sequence, like being properly blown away by how that was unfolding. So I remember that a turning point where it wasn't just about being creeped out by this thing. Like, it was, Jesus, this is properly, like, how the hell did they do that? Like that's incredible stuff. But yeah, it's one of those things where there's a comforting, there's something about those windows and that's quite comforting in itself in a nostalgic sort of way. But the other films I have very little time for. They're kind of interesting in how they unfold and go through different sorts of genres. And so,
to begin with, should we, just in case someone listening doesn't really, again, like a lot of people, I think, know roughly what Amityville is. It's a haunted house type thing. Maybe there's a murder involved. But a basic rundown of what it was and then what the films are, what each film is, because they're all kind of distinct in their own way. So Amityville, there was a... do you want to explain about the DeFeo murders? I forget the address. Ocean Avenue, somewhere in Amityville, New York.
1-1...
I think that's a 2.
112 Ocean Avenue.
112 Ocean Avenue. Okay.
To the best of my recollection, the house was... I think this is correct. The house was owned by the DeFeo family before the DeFeo family who died in that house moved in. So I think it was owned prior to that by older relatives. I think so. In any case, this Italian American family moved in at some point, and at some point, the son, or one of the sons, Ronald, he started to, well, his claims afterwards were that he started to feel like he was that there was some supernatural force in the house and it was communicating with him, or it was a demonic presence, whether it belonged to the house or had followed him there. But in any case, there was a night when the entire family, except him, were killed.
Shot,
yeah. And the story is, or in fact, the truth is, sorry, this is a really, hang on, right, okay. So a lot of that you can leave away, right? Okay. So there's a house. it's a lovely, fairly big house in Long Island, and
although it's nowhere near as detached as the movies make it seem. In real life, it's actually very close to other houses on a street, but in the films, the house they use is, right by a lake and seems to be pretty isolated.
It seems like it's almost like Let's Scare Jessica to Death or something. It's like it's like as if it's way out Woodstock or something.
Yeah.
So the story is that this family were in there. There was a young guy, the son of them, one of the sons, the oldest son, and he shows up in a pub apparently one day, in a state of distress, and he says that the rest of his family have been killed, have been shot, and sure enough, when an investigation kicks off, they go, and it's true that the rest of his family, so two sisters, one a lot younger than the other, I think, a younger brother, and the two parents were all killed. They were all, if I remember the details are, they were all sort of face down, with their hands to their heads, and they had all been shot. However it had happened, the suggestion is that it managed to happen that each person was killed without the rest of them being aware, or without making enough noise for anyone else to have heard any of this. So that was the initial thing, and then it became the case that Ronald DeFeo himself was charged with murdering the rest of his family, and his plea was eventually one of insanity. But in the middle of that, there was this talk that it had been that he was a victim of demonic possession. I guess it was at a time. I mean, this was what, 1974, 5, around that sort of time.
I think maybe even a little bit earlier than that. But yeah.
It would have been The Exorcist would have been out in the air by then. Certainly the recent film, which I only learned about recently as well, is the Amityville Murders, which is basically a remake of the second one. There's a part in that where one of the other characters quotes Reagan from The Exorcist. So,
really?
I don't know if it actually was out and about by the time, but I think it was. So probably there was a bit of that in the air. And I guess it made sense but it didn't work.
Well, it's also probably worth pointing out that DeFeo is he still alive? He's died now, hasn't he?
I thought he was still alive.
He might still be alive.
But just 'cause I saw a recent interview. He may have died since then. Actually, you may be right.
Well, he has changed his story a whole lot of times, and even within the same interview or the same confession, his story will change completely. So the demonic possession angle is just one of many. Then there was another one I seem to remember where he said that he landed with a girlfriend, perhaps, or you said there was someone else involved who actually did the murders, and he was just sort of along for the ride. It's changed a lot, and I think Occam's razor is that he.
Yeah, and there was also some stuff to do with. Yeah, I think so. I mean, but there have been suggestions that the family had links to organized crime.
What's that? The Genovese family. Yeah. Yes, that's right.
So, I mean, I don't know how solid that is, and how much of that is just kind of stereotypical kind of. Well, they were Italian American. They must have had some involvement.
No, it is true. I think his uncle was a capo regime or something in one of those families. Which, I don't know if that actually has anything to do with the murders, but supposedly.
Well, they say that young Ronnie was quite proud of that connection, and could be heard boasting about it, and I guess the same way people do, I'll get my brother to you or whatever, but it's just in his case, I'll get the mob to you. so I don't know, but yeah, there were connections there, and so there's been some suggestion that there was money that went missing, and different things like this. But then the house eventually, so obviously. Strangely enough, usually when this happens, or at least I always assumed that what happened was that houses like that just, with that kind of, but then this is the thing, was it notorious prior to the Lutz business? Well, no. But not long after this family move in, the Lutzes, they're both, as far as I know, they're both, they had children from previous marriages, I think.
I think the woman had children from previous marriages, and he was their stepfather, George Lutz, and I want to say Kathy.
Yeah,
Lutz?
Kathy. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
He had some sort of military background.
I didn't know about that.
Well, it's one of the. It's one of the, because I didn't get because prior to this I started to read John G. Jones's The Amityville Horror Part 2, which I've had about here for a million years and never looked very much into. It has nothing to do with the film. The Amityville has nothing to do with Amityville 2. But it does. There was a bit where I thought there was a detail that I kind of I don't know where it is now, but there was a point where the author made clear, almost like a non sequitur sort of way, he was also very well trained in the martial arts. So it's like so George moved in.
Yeah, well then again, I will say this before we get into the Lutzes too much. So basically, Amityville Horror, as far as the movies go, the first one is based off the Lutzes having moved into this house where a real life murder had taken place. And the Lutzes are real, and they did move into this house where the real life murder had taken place. They did flee it, and then claimed that all sorts of paranormal goings on were the reason for that. Came up with, I don't know if they came up with it, but sold that story, made a book out of it. The book was sold, turned into a film, and that is what makes the first Amityville film. But it is worth mentioning, though, that the Lutzes are notoriously, at least George, is notoriously untrustworthy. Also changes his story quite often. Also is very litigious and sues a lot of people based on this. So it also doesn't surprise me that, him being very well trained in the martial arts, that sounds like the kind of thing he might put out there.
It's a wee bit Neil Breen.
Yeah.
Is that your man's name? Neil Breen?
Neil Breen, the film director of a sort, who cast himself in his own movies as an action sort of superhero, despite
the way presumably George would probably.
Yeah, well,
possibly
he
potentially
was,
do.
I think he was. It's fair to say that the Lutzes had the most direct involvement with the first film, and less so with the second, and virtually nothing with the third. Which is why I think he did sue both the makers of the second and the third one at various points for not including him. But yeah, in the first one, he's assuming he had some kind of direct involvement with it. He is played by James Brolin.
Yeah.
A very at the time anyway, a kind of hunk, right?
Yeah, and later Ryan Reynolds, as you said. So
yeah. Although I think he got very angry with that remake for some reason or other. The real George Lutz, I think he was very unhappy with that. He sued them and made all kinds of claims. But I think it was because they didn't consult him directly. I think that was the reason. I think it's that they were using his name and story, but didn't involve, i.e., probably pay him as a consultant. I don't know, but that's he seems to want to sue anyone and everyone who touches.
And I guess you can run with his story. Because you watched the first one recently. Does it have a scene like I remember there being in the remake where he's chopping wood and he's getting the children to hold the wood? Is that scene in the original one?
I don't believe he's getting the children to hold the wood. No,
because there is a sense that he's about to clatter an axe into one of them. So it's maybe stuff like that. He, it's like it's okay. I can be in red light and my beard all weird, but I draw a line suggesting that I tried to take an axe to
no, actually, in the original, he's chopping the wood, and his wife is nearby, sort of having a go at him for chopping too much wood.
Actually, doesn't it get sort of, and this is sort of before The Shining, whereas Amityville II has traces of post-Shining about it, but in the first one, isn't there almost like a kind of like Jack Nicholson at the typewriter kind of thing with the wood chopping, like it's relentless. It's like
where he's getting
no wood
obsessed.
left. We don't.
But so anyway, so we don't. But so the first Amityville is based on the Lutzes, who were the family who moved in after the murders and claimed that there was some kind of demonic presence that forced them to flee because it was making them all go a bit wrong. As far as I know, like in the book and the film, it seems to mostly whatever this demonic presence is, Indian burial ground, I think, is the official explanation given by them. Even though there's no local historian who will corroborate that. But Indian burial ground, and it seems to just make priests or nuns sick when they go in the house.
Yeah, it brings them on flies.
It'll throw some flies and make you vomit. Which I thought is quite funny because it happens twice in the first film.
Yes.
First, the priest comes in at the beginning because he's, I suppose, being asked to bless the house. But he sort of wanders in without anyone knowing he's there. goes into one of the bedrooms, gets some flies coming at him, and then leaves the house in horror and is sick for a week or so. And then, not very much later than that, a nun comes, who I think is an aunt or something like that. But she comes, and exactly the same thing happens. No flies this time, but she just comes and immediately has to leave. I'm feeling very unwell. And just goes away. And it's like, well, do we need to see that twice? But it actually reminded me, I think they took that for Paranormal Activity. One of the things that I found funniest about the first Paranormal Activity film was that they hire a kind of demonologist or a paranormal investigator,
That's right, yes.
And he comes all the way from... I remember he's very far away and he doesn't want to make the trip. He's like, oh, well, no, it's probably fine. And then he's convinced to come. He comes all the way, comes to the front door and then says, oh, I can't go in there. It's too scary. And just leaves. Anyway, I didn't know if that might be a reference, but yeah.
So no flies in no flies in Amityville 2 either, really. I remember loads of flies. There's barely any.
Yeah, you
There's
might
also
be right.
chasing the priest out of the house type stuff.
Yeah, that happens again.
There's no I mean, because flies is one of the things you associate with the series, I suppose, with the franchise is the rooms full of flies.
Yeah.
And the bother that this causes for...
It does happen in the third one. At the beginning, someone gets devoured by flies.
Well, flies are, of course, famously very Lutheran in the
Yeah. But anyway, so yeah, the first one's based on the Lutzes, the one they had direct involvement in. The second one, though, which is probably the one we'll talk about the most, just because it's, well, first of all, it's the one that we both seem to actually quite like, and arguably it's the most interesting one. But that one is a prequel to the first film.
Yeah.
But kind of. It's a prequel to the first film, so you think it's based on the DeFeo murders. Mm-hmm. And it is. But they've changed the names.
They've changed the names.
And some other things about the family maybe are a little different.
Yeah, and it is evidently not... There are things about it that mean it can't be set at the time the DeFeo murders happened, for instance. There are things... I mean, would that type of Walkman even have been...
Yeah, no, it's set... It seems to be set in the 80s. It was released in 1982, and it seems to be set around then.
There's nothing that says, like, years, however many years earlier or whatever. Not
to the point where you would be forgiven, I think, watching it without any prior knowledge. You'd be forgiven for thinking it was a sequel, not a prequel.
Yeah.
Unless you'd paid very close attention in the first film where they mention... well, no, because in the first film, I think they mention Ronald DeFeo by name.
Yeah.
And then in the second film, the family has a completely different name. And the kid isn't called Ronald. So they're arriving, just having moved in. Is almost identical in the setup to the first one with the Lutzes arriving. So I don't know if there is actually... Again, if I hadn't known that it was essentially a prequel, I'm not sure I would have known any different. I think I would have thought it was a sequel. Just this house. Lots of people moving into this house and having trouble.
Yeah, the only... Yeah. I mean, I guess if you knew... I mean, I'm trying to think, actually, how did I know it was when did I know it was a prequel? Did I always know? Or... Because, yeah, I mean, as you said, there's nothing really that says that it is, except for the credit. Well, this is where the issue for the Lutzes was they wanted the film to be based on this book by John G. Jones, which is called The Amityville Horror Part 2. So you would think, well, that seems sensible. But there's not a huge amount that happens in the Amityville Horror Part 2. But it is all about the Lutzes. And off they go. And as Liddy Warren told them at a point, the evil will follow you. It's not bound to the house. So really what you were looking at was so the book is largely about what goes on at one of their parents. I think it's Kathy's mum's house they go to, or it's one of their houses, I know. And George
could say it's a cash cow. A new book for every time you move, and you make money on one book, you move into a nicer house, but the demon's coming with you, so time to write another book and move. We should probably mention at this point.
Like, do we follow the Lutzes or do we follow the house? Like, where does this franchise go?
Well, I mean, by the Lutzes, from their story, it's that this house was built on the site of some kind of Indian burial ground.
Yeah.
So therefore, you would think it was tied to the house, but apparently it can also follow you around. We should probably mention at this point who the Warrens are and why they're involved, because we're going to be casually mentioning them, I think.
Yeah.
Throughout.
Do you want to give us?
Oh, please. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Warrens. I think they're a ghastly couple of people. They were I mean, if you're familiar now with the Conjuring films, then that's who the Warrens are. The Conjuring franchise dramatizes the Warrens and kind of makes them sexy superheroes against evil. But in reality, they were two fairly unremarkable husband and wife parapsychologists, or what were they? Paranormal investigators, paranormal warriors, who started popping up anytime anything unusual went on anywhere, and sort of popping up and saying, well, it's demonic in nature, it's demonic possession, it's demonic interference in some way or other. So they've sort of associated themselves with a lot of, like, the Enfield haunting, for instance.
Yeah.
The Enfield poltergeist in England, which was a famous story about a single mother with children who claimed that their house was afflicted by poltergeists. Now, the Warrens, and certainly The Conjuring 2, makes it seem like the Warrens solved that. They went and dealt with it. In reality, they turned up uninvited after it got a bit of attention in the news. Turned up uninvited and weren't even allowed to go in the house. They were sent away. And someone else who was involved said that Warren had basically offered them a lot of money to go along with his version of the story. Or said that you could make a lot of money going along with his version of the story, which, that says something. And this is a theme that follows the Warrens throughout their life. They tend to... I mean, I can't remember who it was who revealed this about Amityville, but he said that it was concocted over a dinner party, like the whole story. Was kind of concocted over.
I've heard.
It was someone. It was either the guy. I think it was didn't they have like their lawyer involved, and he sort of became their literary agent. Like the whole thing was a bit strange. Like the way that the story came about and was publicized. Something all a little bit odd about it. But the Warrens didn't turn up until after the family had already left the house. Apparently, they went to the house about a month or two after the Lutzes had left and started making, trying to get in the papers over it. And went in, and Ed Warren predictably said, "Yep, spooky house for sure. Definitely a demon here." He's saying he heard voices. I also am hearing voices. And that's basically what they did. But the funny thing about the Warrens is they must have been kind of annoyed that I'm sure they got some money from Amityville, from the franchise kind of
I would imagine
originating.
so.
I would imagine somehow, some way they did. But I think what happened later was Ed Warren died. I want to say about 15 years ago, maybe even earlier. But Lorraine was still alive, and she's thinking, well, Lorraine is the crappest of the two. Like she seemed to be there mostly to go along with what Ed was saying, but her superpower was that she could she was a medium, I suppose.
She would faint now and again.
She would sort of faint and say that I think she was the one who was supposed to have a direct connection with the ghost or the entity, whereas Ed was more of the fighter,
Yeah. Was there because in the Conjuring films, as you were saying recently when I said I was going to watch the third of those, and you had said about how heavily it leans into the kind of Warriors of Christ stuff. What was there? Do you think was there a sort of was there an element of that to their self-promotion? Was it a kind of culture wars kind of, Christian soldier kind of thing?
I'm not sure. I mean, they were evangelical. Like that's pretty well known, which is why it's kind of strange that in the first Conjuring films, that's sort of there. The kind of power of Christ compels you stuff, but it's usually kind of conspicuously drafted. They'll draft in some kind of priest character who comes with them to do some of that stuff. Yeah, which made me think that it's no secret that kind of Bible bashing or even just overt Christian terminology or content in Hollywood doesn't do all that well anymore. And especially by the time Conjuring came out, they're selling films to other territories, China and stuff, and so I thought, well, maybe that's the reason they've sort of downplayed that aspect of the Warrens, because the real life Warrens were as Christian as you could get, evangelical almost, and were going to people, people whose children, for instance, were suffering from epilepsy or some other kind of disorder and trying to pray the devil out of them. That's what they were. But you don't really see that in the first couple of Conjuring movies so much, or at least it's not the emphasis. Whereas in the third one, I think they kind of lean into it a little bit towards the end in a way that's sort of surprising and a bit unusual. But no, I think what really happened was that the Warrens were sort of known-ish for being tangentially related to the Amityville haunting and other things, but I think there might have been something in them that was a little bitter that they didn't get much of the limelight from this, and they weren't in any of the movies, kicking ass for the Lord. But then, so I think Ed dies first. Yeah, Ed dies, and then Lorraine Warren, who's, left to her own devices, goes, oh, well, I could unearth some of our other investigations and sell them to movie studios. And I think that the talk around The Conjuring was that, this was an investigation that's so disturbing and so traumatic and so horrifying that she hadn't felt that she was able to release it into the public consciousness.
Until
now, then the Conjuring comes out, and it does have a big caption at the beginning saying, like, this is so disturbing that until now you haven't been allowed to hear of it. As far as I know, they wrote a book about it and everything. It happened in the 70s. I think it was the Perrin household. Now you look at The Conjuring and you think, this is the Amityville horror again. It is virtually the same story and the same. Even the setup of the film is almost, a family arrives. There's instantly sort of things going wrong. There's the matriarch in The Conjuring, patriarch in the Amityville, starting to act violent and starting to seem to have bad intentions against the family. Then it turns out it's a spirit that's possessing them, causing them to do this. Very, very similar, and certainly not so disturbing that it couldn't possibly have been heard by human ears until now, especially when the Amityville horror already exists. It's very, very much the same. In fact, maybe a little less disturbing, because the Amityville horror was based on a real-life murder that actually happened, whereas I think a lot of what goes on in The Conjuring, probably safe to say it didn't happen at all.
Well, yeah, and another key difference, and it never occurred to me until I was listening to Kim Newman's commentary track on the DVD of the Amityville II, where he points out that one of the great benefits of having it based on a true story is that you can end when you decide you want to end. So you don't have to resolve anything because it's based on reality. So the story is the family went in, things went to fuck really quickly, spooky, and then they went, and that's it, the end. so like there's nobody comes in to resolve things or fix it, or whereas in The Conjuring they do sort of.
Yeah. And then, it's the Warrens who come in. That's the other thing that I think is in my mind, kind of insidious about the Conjuring films. But yes, the Lorraine Warren not only goes, oh, well, I got a bunch of other investigations for you to make movies of. It's also, and we're going to be in it. Like, me and Ed are going to be the heroes of the story. We're going to be practically infallible. And in fact, especially in the sequel and in the third film, even more so, there seems to be quite a lot of sort of score settling going on. It seems almost like the Warrens, by giving the rights and having direct input into these films, may have stipulated at one point, well, we need a bit where we kind of win. We win some point scoring against this person. Because, in reality, they were quite rightly sort of laughed out of many places. They had no good evidence for anything, and they were, they were frankly ridiculous. So they'd be up in debates with skeptics. I remember there's, I think, 2 skeptics who constantly butted heads with them. And unfortunately, I don't remember their names. But I feel like, in the Conjuring, The Conjuring 3, The Devil Made Me Do It, which is also very similar to the DeFeo case. Anyway, but we'll get to that. But yeah, there's a lot in there of, you know, people doubting them and then very quickly being punished for doubting them.
It's like kind of it's like a more elaborate, and you know, Father Ted acceptance speech, you know.
No, exactly. And now
become to liars.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a lot of that. And well, we'll get to the Conjuring films later because they're, you know, honestly, they could probably have an episode in and of themselves. But anyway, so the first Amityville is the Lutzes. The second one is the DeFeo murders, although with a different name. And obviously, it starts, I would say probably the first half to 2/3 of it is the DeFeo case, but then it goes into kind of The Exorcist again.
It does, yeah.
Where he is absolutely possessed and there's a priest sort of trying to cast it out of him. And then the third film isn't related to any of that at all. The third film is completely... I don't think it bears any resemblance to anything in the original story. It has the
same house.
Yeah.
Not blew up. And
it's got the house.
Not only did it blow up, but if you're looking at this as some sort of prequel, it blew up before the Lutzes moved in.
The second film, the house blows up at the end, but it also blows up, I think, during the Lutzes' time there. It keeps blowing up, this house. In the second film, towards the end, when the priest brings the son who's possessed back to try and cast the demon out of him, and the house blows up while he's doing that. But it must be some sort of metaphorical explosion because
he's still nothing
is actually
he hasn't
blown up. So that seems to be a running theme that the house has to blow up at some point. And
eventually they ditch the house altogether for a while. Even though the house is the thing that is iconic. It's the kind of hockey mask of the thing, is those windows. So once the series drops that, I mean, you're like, well, what the hell's the point? It's kind of like that Friday the 13th actual TV series, which had nothing to do with Jason Voorhees or anything, and was just kind of like the Warrens, actually. Was it not like some sort of antique shop, and each antique had this strange story or something?
Oh,
like that?
I don't know. But that does sound... Another thing to make fun of the Warrens for is that they have a fucking museum. Just sort of in their like back shed, which claims to have all of their evil artifacts that they've accrued.
Just stuff that they've went around charity shops like getting and just left it in the coal shed for a week. And I mean the glass case.
The Annabelle doll. The Annabelle doll is the funniest one when you see what the real thing is. And it's just a Raggedy Ann doll that they've put in a kind of glass cabinet. It's very disappointing once I think for people who saw the film and was like, oh my god, that doll is very scary, and then when you see the real thing you think, okay.
So the first film is a big success, even if whether it was especially well liked or not, but it did enough to sort of cement Amityville as something that belonged to pop culture now, I suppose. So you could really do whatever you were going to do with it. Rights, not. But then again, I mean, in this case, you can't claim that a postcode is your, you can't copyright geography. So you can't tell someone you can't make a film about that bit of road over there because we as our intellectual property.
But also the murders, the real life murders, the DeFeo murders can't be copyrighted either.
No, because unless the only way you could copyright a lot of this stuff was if a lot of this stuff you made up.
It's funny that, it was funny that it had to go into a book first. But I mean the fact that it uses all of this is based on, unlike Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th, you can argue that any serial killer film, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is sort of based on Ed Gein-ish. Nightmare on Elm Street is supposedly based on Wes Craven reading something about people dying in their sleep.
Yeah.
But with the thing that separates, I think, Amityville is that it does at least have its basis in a real life murder, something that actually happened and that was horrible. Whether the films, well, the second one does depict that. I mean, the first one does, in sort of flashbacks, you see a gun going off every now and then. But the first one, you can say, all right, that's fine. It's the Lutz's story about living in this haunted house where something bad happened. Fine. But it becomes more difficult to sort of say, right, and I guess this is why we're doing it on this podcast, right? When you're taking a real life tragedy or something horrific in real life and then making a film out of it, that always is a little tricky, and especially in the second one where I think it's faithful-ish to the DeFeo murders. I mean, the murders themselves are fairly faithful, I think. Yeah. Where this boy did go around and shoot his whole family, including his very young siblings. But then saying, but he's possessed by a demon, and now we're going to go have this priest kind of try and get this demon out of him, and that's kind of the end of it.
You're going to have...
steals him from the prison, well, from the hospital, to get this demon out, and then gets the demon into himself. It's very, obviously Exorcist influenced at the end.
There are a lot of stuff. There are things that are direct. Yeah. I was gonna say direct lifts, literally direct lifts, like whenever the words lift up on the skin.
That's right. Yeah. Help me or save me or whatever it is. Yeah. Now, I don't know, but I suppose I'd be interested to hear. I think you're going to have more to say about it than I will, because I'm still very much... My opinions are changing over the years, but it used to be that I think anything is sort of fair game to make a film about, whether or not it's true, like whether or not it's based on a real story or real people. I used to think, well, it's fine because at the end of the day, artistic expression trumps all. I don't really think that anymore, and I've grown more and more uneasy with some things. Like even Once Upon a Time in Hollywood with the reimagining of the Tate murders Tate murders that don't happen in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood at the end. So I've been thinking about that sort of thing, and then rewatching Amityville 2, and I'm thinking, I don't know. Is it all right? Is it all right to do that? I understand taking inspiration from things, and everything is inspired by reality to some extent. Every horrible, grotesque, graphic thing, is inspired by some form of reality. But to specifically adapt a real life horror and turn it into your kind of fictional supernatural horror, I don't know if I like that anymore.
And so soon as well, so soon after, like it really was not.
It would have been about 10 years or just under.
If it was I think it was 1974, was it, with the murders? So this was.
And then Amityville 2 comes out in 82. Yeah. And it's directed by. This made me laugh to remember. It's directed by another Damien, but this one's he's doubled down and he's gone for Damien Damiani, an Italian filmmaker who I think I read somewhere had been described as the most American Italian filmmaker.
Yeah,
in terms of his sensibilities, I think it was Pasolini who said that about him. In a kind of disparaging way. He said that this is the most most American of our Italian filmmakers. Although I kind of disagree. That Amityville 2 is very Italian in a lot of ways. I think
because when I was thinking the same sorts of things in the run up to this, like about using actual murders and things like that in this kind of way. And I was thinking, well, I suppose it wasn't that long after the Tate LaBianca murders that the first sort of Manson films, or films very clearly based on that anyway, would start to appear. Usually, scrungy kind of exploitation-y type things. Mm-hmm. So I suppose it kind of became a pop culture product of its own They kind of had a separate life.
Yeah.
But the difference is, because then I thought, well, Amityville's kind of the same. Although, was it as much the same in 1982? I don't know. But the difference is that even those Manson films that may be very leery and very lurid and grindhousey and all the rest, they don't do what this does. They don't start from the assumption, or they're not. To understand Amityville and Amityville II, you have to understand that DeFeo was telling the truth. He was possessed by demons, and everything he did as a result of that. That's what the film tells you. There's no ambiguity whatsoever. Whereas the Manson films do not start from a place where Charles Manson is indeed Jesus. He is indeed the one who will bring harmony through conflict and all the rest. So that's very different. It's icky in a it's kind of like I have the same issue with the exorcism of Emily Rose, which I think is grotesque. Because basically it's a film, it's a courtroom drama.
Annalise, no, it's not. Is it Annalise?
It is, yeah.
That they're based on? Yeah.
Annalise, is it? How do you pronounce? Is it Michael?
Oh yeah, Annalise. Yeah, not Annalise Nelson. Annalise. Michelle.
Yeah. Well, that story is. I mean, if anyone's remotely interested in this sort of stuff, will have. I mean, there's a song on the first Public Image album about her called Annalise. And yeah, so essentially what that was a young girl was killed because she had mental health issues and physical issues, and she was subjected to a horrific ordeal in an attempt to exorcise her of whatever. And the exorcism of Emily Rose is a sort of is a dramatization of that, which legitimizes the claims by using a kind of John Grisham, kind of Time to Kill sort of courtroom drama thing. Yeah. So it's not a horror film. So don't be thinking that it's it's this, but it does. The point is that the priest did nothing wrong. Yeah. And so there's a similar thing with this, and as you say, I mean, this was in recent memory, and so there's something quite objectionable about
this actual murder that happened. It wasn't actually his fault because he was in the world of this film anyway, absolutely possessed by a demon.
Yeah, and I mean. In a way, I mean, if horror can't be operating in poor taste, then what can it do? And so it's not that I would. I think it's a difficult one to defend, both as the person who has decided to create this and as the person who's saying this is amazing. Like there was a recent Northern Irish horror film called The Devil's Doorway, which took the Magdalene laundries. So the state essentially prisons for young women who had gone astray.
Or were unweddable or something like that. Yeah.
Horrific abuses. And that film hinged on the idea that it was the devil. The devil was to blame. He was, or it was causing the nuns to do this and that, which is rather letting the church off the hook.
It really is, isn't it? When this was an abuse absolutely perpetuated by the church. Oh no, but it was the church was being controlled by the devil. Is that?
Yeah, if anything, the church needed to be in there more.
Yeah, would have been solved with more God. Yeah.
So there's that kind of thing, and maybe it's because I guess I grew up with the films as I said, and it feels divorced from. But I mean, it is, and I suppose as well. The other thing with the Manson stuff is that there is a direct link from the Manson things and the kind of, the imagery and the things associated with that leads through into the likes of The Exorcist even and into this, whether that's the general sense of a generational shift and there's something going on with our children that we don't really understand, and it could be quite dark, or it's the actual writing of things like pigs on the wall, the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, I noticed recently rewatching The Exorcist that just how much of a part or how heavily that's kind of woven through it, because the same thing when you see the steps, there's very clearly written in great big red letters on the steps, pigs. So things like that,
okay.
I wouldn't say anybody was intentionally setting out to do it, but that stuff was filtering through into. So there's a line connecting them, I guess. And in fact, in 2018, I discovered there was a film called The Amityville Murders, which is the same name as the book this Amityville II is based on. And it's basically a remake, just with a more naturalistic, I guess, approach. So it's the DeFeo story again. It's not quite as surreal and but it starts with a photograph of of one of the books about the Manson murders, and that's something to pick up on a wee bit, because that's an interesting late development in the franchise.
And I'm not familiar at all with that. I haven't seen anything except for the 3 Amityville horror films, and then the remake with Ryan Reynolds. Just going back to what you were saying about taking a real life case and then kind of retroactively saying, but the villain was right all along, essentially, or was possessed by a demon. So that's the truth of it. It made me think, in many ways, Amityville 2 does everything right. Like, I think you can take things from reality and then turn them into a supernatural horror film. When I have a problem with it is when it's a real thing, using the real, and basically almost making a claim about what really happened. Which, arguably Amityville 2 does do. But I think Amityville 2's maybe the reason I find it a little bit more palatable is that it does everything else that I think would excuse it from that sort of thing. It changes the name of the family. The family doesn't look... It's not saying this is, this is Ronald DeFeo and his family and here's what he did to them. So even though we kind of laughed, it's a different name and it doesn't make any sense. In some ways, I think it's different enough. Obviously, it takes the idea of a kid killing his family. But other than that, it's sort of different enough that you could be like, all right, this is a fictional film. I mean, obviously, it is a fictional film. But its main mistake, I think, is being part of the Amityville series. Because Amityville, the reason that series exists is because originally this real-life murder did happen. So you can't divorce it from that. Even if you do change the names, then nothing at all in the second half bears any resemblance to anything true at all. I don't think there was a priest involved with Ronald DeFeo or anything. So I think the film itself, taken on its own, is fine. But the fact that it is clearly meant to be the Ronald DeFeo murders makes it a little murkier, perhaps. I also don't know. I mean, one of the kind of most daring, I suppose, things about the Amityville 2 is that whole incest subplot.
Yes.
Which is pretty, for a sequel to as mainstream a horror film as Amityville 1 was, having that in it, which also I don't think bears any resemblance. I don't know if there was anything to do with Ronald DeFeo and his sister.
I don't know if if that was a detail in the... I've never read that.
Not that I've heard, yeah. So if there, so I think that's an invention of Damienson or whatever his name is.
And it's strange. In many ways, it does not feel like this, like a sequel in a franchise that has been, pulled so many different directions to so little valuable end. It doesn't feel like it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like it should be that it should. But as you said, but maybe as well. Maybe part of the reason why it seems is, to me, I think it's breathtaking. Maybe it's because of its proximity to those to the films around it, which are absolutely not.
Quite shit. Yeah. Well, is it worth maybe talking about things that we like it? Because we're sort of saying, oh, but this one's good. But then we're talking about it like it's not very good. So some things that I think are really... Well, you mentioned the camera work earlier on, and that is absolutely far more impressive, certainly than anything in the first one. The most interesting thing the first one's got going on is, the house with a kind of high contrast red filter on it. That's about as artistic as it got.
That's actually just when you say that, just before, that's one of the things that I love most about this is that it's blue instead of red. It's the windows are blue light, it's snowing, it's frosty and autumnal and foggy, whereas the first film is sweating all the time.
But it does a lot of kind of impressive stuff with the cameras, like a lot of now this. When did the first Evil Dead come out? 80. Same year. So it can't have been influenced by Evil Dead. I would be that couldn't have happened. I don't think.
No, it wouldn't have been.
Because they wouldn't have been able to see Evil Dead before.
No, but it looks like they did.
It does, yeah, and that's why I wondered to myself. I was like, well, because there's all this POV of point of view shots of the entity kind of running around the house, and sneaking up on people, and there's actually
and then the exorcism at the end when he's on the roof and he's got proper full Deadite makeup.
and talks similar to a Dead, but then again, The Exorcist also, I suppose. So it's got a lot of that, which is quite good, but also the camera does some pretty interesting things. There's a very good shot where it kind of goes over his head. You're seeing presumably from the POV of the entity, you're behind his head, and then the camera sort of lifts up above his head, goes the whole way around, and then lands in front of him.
And it kind of it's almost as if it's hanging there. It kind of it sort of it swings back and forward slightly.
Which is very clever for the time, especially to do that within a set. It's pretty clever and would have taken a lot of effort. And I'm surprised, with a sequel to a franchise like this, usually you expect that to be the kind of cash in, which hasn't had all that much thought put into it. But this one, they allotted time in their schedule and budget for things like that, which aren't essential to the film being made, aren't essential to the story, but definitely add something to it that I think the first one certainly didn't have much of.
Yeah, that whole sequence. So that's towards that's the point where
right
the
before
young
he gets
fella
possessed.
Sonny, who is the Ronnie Defoe, he's in the house himself, and this is the point where finally the demon or whatever it is does the actual possessing bit. So there's a sequence that starts with him upstairs going down into the
basement where the
celery bit.
Yeah, the basement full of shit.
There's an arm.
but there's a very funny bit at the beginning where they're moving into the house, and she gets one of the movers. I think one of the movers says, "Oh, you've got an extra room back here in the basement." And he's like, "Oh, I'll go and look at it for you if you want." And he sort of crawls in, instantly starts getting shit on. And he spends such a long time just going, like he doesn't, like any normal person would do, kind of recoil and go, oh God, that's horrible. He spends a while in there just getting shit, like landing on his head and all over him, and he's just going, and he comes back out, and she's like, oh, what's wrong with you? So I'm covered in shit now. But then they never mention in the first film that the hidden room under the basement becomes kind of a pivotal plot point at the end. In this one, the family, they learn about it at the very beginning. The mother sees someone go in there and get covered in shit.
Yeah.
And then it's never mentioned again. She doesn't seem to mention that it might, maybe it's worth investigating this room full of feces that we have in our new house. By
today's prequel standards, we would understand that just as the bit where we know where the flies came from now. That's all we need to know. That's enough. All right, so that's where they happen. Oh,
yeah, okay. No, it comes right towards the end when the priest goes into the house and you see presumably little Native Americans coming out of it.
That's right, the lost people. Yeah.
Yeah, which, I like that bit. But other than that, it's just a kind of funny... But I guess we get the impression that that's where the evil's coming from. It's just a room full of shit in their house. But yeah, so the demon, the entity, sort of, it doesn't chase him as such. It's quite well done because you're seeing this guy's reaction to him knowing that something is around, and sort of something's following him. But he's not looking at it for most of the time. He's not looking at it like, oh, I can see a demon or something like that. He's just not quite sure, and it's coming in front of his face and then going behind, and it's kind of chasing him without it being like a chase sequence until the very end when it finally, then his eyes kind of widen. I think he sort of sees something.
It follows him from down in that shitty room down below, up the stairs into his room, and then it does this. I don't know what the hell it's doing. He's on his bed and I mean that whole
knocks him down onto his bed, and then
it knocks him down, and it starts doing this thing where it sucks his stomach in, and the camera kind of tends to sort of
crashes in and out.
Yeah, crashes in and out in time with whatever's going on in his stomach. And there's a lot of bumpy, gooey practical effects, and
and the lighting is kind of changing each time. It's really, really well done.
It's incredible. And
his face his face is changing too. Each time the camera pulls out, his face has gotten more kind of
more like Michael Jackson actually in Thriller. When I come to think,
a little bit. And actually, some of the, especially when you see him possessed towards the end, there are these kind of pockets or pustules on his neck and face that are being inflated in the same way that they did with the werewolf makeup.
With the werewolf makeup, yeah.
So obviously it's inspired by Thriller.
Obviously. Although earlier than that, before that, I think he looks distractingly like Mick Jagger in the Start Me Up video.
Yes.
Especially. So at the point in that possession rigmarole, when he's going up the stairs backwards, all I could hear was this time I was watching it, I was like, I really need to watch that song because I reckon that's going to work really well. But yeah, that whole, I mean, I've heard people, the other person on the DVD commentary, actually, I think it's Stephen Thrower, about sequences like that, and he'll say like, yes, really is. I mean, it's too good to be part of this, really. But you're like, but it's all that good. So it's all part of this. So surely, if all the bits of this are that good, then maybe this is good.